So let's talk about Joan of Arc. We all have this image in our heads, right? The teenage girl in shining armor, a warrior sent by God to save France. But the real story, the one you find when you dig into the actual records, is so much stranger, so much more complex than the legend. It's a story about faith, yeah, but it's also about brutal politics and a legacy so powerful that people are still fighting over it today. 489 years. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's a really long time. And it's the absolute key to understanding the central mystery of Joan of Arc. It's how long it took for the Catholic Church to completely 180-degree reverse its decision on her. Because, get this, in 1431, that very same church condemned her as a heretic, a witch, and had her burned at the stake. Then, nearly 5 centuries later, in 1920, they officially declared her a saint. So, how in the world does a convicted heretic become one of the most beloved saints in Catholicism? Well, that's the paradox we're going to unravel. To get to the bottom of that, we have to start with the person at the heart of it all. We have to look past the myth and find the real, historical young woman from a tiny village who would, against every single odd, change the course of history. So you have to picture the world Joan was born into. France was being torn apart by the 100 Years' War with England. She was a peasant girl, the daughter of farmers, couldn't read or write, but was incredibly devout. And the one thing that defined her entire life, the source of all her power and ultimately all her trouble, was her claim that she was being guided by the voices of saints. And here's the thing about those voices she heard. They weren't just offering spiritual comfort. No, they gave her a mission that must have sounded completely insane: to pick up a sword, lead an army, drive the English out of France, and get the true heir, Charles VII, crowned as king. Her rise was just meteoric. I mean, look at this. At 17, she somehow convinces the skeptical Charles to actually give her an army. Just a few weeks later, boom, she shatters the English siege of Orleans, a victory that completely flips the script on the entire war. By July, she's standing right next to Charles as he's crowned king, just like she said she would. But, that kind of success makes you powerful enemies. And less than a year later, she's captured in battle. And her capture leads us to the most well-documented part of her life, her trial. And this, right here, is where you see how this was never really about faith. It was all about power. Here is the absolute crux of the matter. The English, who were pulling the strings on this whole trial, didn't just want to get rid of a pesky military leader. They needed to destroy her reputation, to undermine the king she'd put on the throne. As the theologian Fernando Altemeier Jr. puts it, if a witch made him king, well then his whole claim to the throne was bogus. It was a political hit job. Let's break this down, because it's fascinating. The charges they leveled against her all looked religious on the surface. Heresy, for saying she spoke directly to God. Witchcraft, claiming her voices were actually demons. And even a charge for wearing men's clothing. But look at the real motives. Each charge was designed to delegitimize King Charles, crush French morale, and make the English claim to the throne look legit. The verdict was a done deal before the trial even started. But here's what they didn't count on. Joan, this illiterate peasant girl, was unbelievably sharp. The judges, all these learned theologians, tried to corner her with these clever theological traps. They asked her, "Do you know if you are in God's grace?" Now that's a classic trick question. If she says yes, that's heresy. If she says no, she's admitting she's a sinner. And her reply? It was just brilliant. It completely turned their own logic against them. But despite her courage, despite her wit, the outcome was inevitable. After weeks of this intense interrogation, Joan of Arc was found guilty. At just 19 years old, she was executed as a heretic. And that was the end of her life. But it was really just the beginning of her journey as this incredibly powerful symbol. So let's shift gears, because this is where the story completely transforms. After her death, her image just explodes, becoming something so much bigger, something that it seems like everyone wanted a piece of. Her official path back into the church's good graces was long, and yep, you guessed it, political. It all started just 25 years after her death. King Charles VII, the guy she crowned, realized it wasn't a great look to have his reign legitimized by a convicted heretic, so he pushed for a new trial. The conviction got thrown out. Then, centuries later, as France got more secular, the church saw a chance. By making this national French hero a saint, they could regain some influence. And in 1920, they finally made it official. And this whole transformation, it wasn't just political or religious. Artists started to reinterpret her story, really cementing her place in our collective imagination. And one of the most powerful examples of this comes from the movies. In 1928, just a few years after she was made a saint, this Danish director, Carl Theodor Dreyer, made an absolute masterpiece. But he did something totally radical. He cut out all the battles, all the big spectacle, and based his entire film on the actual trial transcripts. His whole movie could be summed up in 3 words: gesture, face, and death. He used these relentless, raw close-ups of the actors, with no makeup, to show you the deep psychological pain she was going through. And the impact was just incredible. As the legendary film critic André Bazin said, it created a feeling of the direct translation of the soul. Think about that. The film took this cold, historical document and turned it into this intimate, emotional experience that shaped how millions of people would come to see and, more importantly, feel the story of Joan of Arc. So, ultimately, her story became this sort of blank slate, a perfect mirror where almost anyone could see their own values reflected back. The historian Helen Castor calls her a kaleidoscopic icon, and it's the perfect description. She's been claimed by literally everyone: nationalists and liberals, the far right and the far left, feminists and traditionalists. Each group looks at her and sees a hero for their own cause. And you can see a really clear example of this in modern politics. The French far right has adopted her as their ultimate nationalist symbol, the defender of France against outsiders. In 2017, the politician Jean-Marie Le Pen even compared his own daughter Marine Le Pen to Joan of Arc, painting her as this lone patriot fighting the establishment. But that creates, you guessed it, another paradox. For a lot of modern Christians, the whole idea of a warrior saint is pretty uncomfortable. As the theologian Maria Clara Bingamer points out, a saint who took up arms, who used violence, that presents a real problem, a serious ambiguity, especially when you think about the message of peace in the Gospels. And that really leaves us with this one last question. Why does her story still feel so immediate, so controversial? Maybe it's because she embodies so many of the contradictions we all still grapple with: faith versus violence, patriotism versus persecution, the lone individual standing up to a massive institution. Her story just forces us to confront these really tough questions. And that's why, 600 years later, Joan of Arc is still such an unsettling and completely essential figure.